So you want to have some melee combat in your game. Alright, we'll be doing it in this video with platformer objects, where both the player and enemies have the platformer behavior, and the ground has the platform behavior, but most of the concepts in this video should apply to your standard top-down beat-em-up as well. You would just use the top-down behavior instead. Let's go over what you need to do to create melee combat in GDevelop. First, we have a playable character with the platformer behavior and the usual set of animations. But down at the bottom, we have these two animations for thrust, and this is not an uppercut, but I'm calling it uppercut. Now if we go to the event sheet, firstly, you only have control of your character, and the animations will only play if the current animation of your character is not thrust, uppercut, or hit. Which means that while you're attacking, or being hit, you don't have control over your character. As for those controls, you have your movement controls, which will simulate the key presses for the character, and flip the character based on which ones are being pressed. And we're simulating button presses because in the behavior we have default controls turned off. And then next we have the basic animations, where if the player is moving, and they're on the floor or jumping or falling, we play the appropriate animation. Whereas if they're on the floor and they're not moving, we play the idle animation. And then we have the attacks. And for this I'm using the J key, but you can make this whatever you want. So if that key is pressed on its own, we'll play the thrust animation. But if the W key is pressed, which is up, and then the J key is pressed, instead we'll do the uppercut. And then going back to the top, you'll see that that means one of these animations is playing, so I can't control the character anymore. So then we have this event. Using an OR condition, we check to see if any of those animations were playing, and then, if that animation is finished, set the animation to idle, which means we'll have control of the character again. And then for those attacks to hit, we need something to check the collision. And in this case, we'll be creating a collision object, which is just a plain square that we're going to create at certain points on the player object. If we go to the object, and then open up points, and then go to the animation, you'll see that I have a point for thrust and uppercut, and I have them put in a place that makes sense for a particular frame of that animation. And so in these two events, we check to see if we've gone past the frame where we want to create the collision object, and then we create that at the point. And then as a subcondition, we check if that collision object is in collision with an enemy, and if it is, we set their animation to hit, and apply forces to them based on the angle between them and the player. So if they're to the right, we'll hit them to the right, and if they're to the left, we'll hit them to the left. But for the uppercut event, we also apply a force along the y-axis to knock them upwards. And then finally, we delete the collision check object. And because it's below this event, it means the object is created and destroyed before it ever renders on screen, so your player won't see it. Although, you only need to create this collision object if your character and weapon are all one sprite object. If your character and weapon are two different objects, you can actually just use the collision mask of your weapon, and then check the collision against the enemy during the right frames of the attack animation. And then to get the enemy to go back to their idle state, we have this event, where if their animation is hit, and they're on the floor, and their animation has finished playing, then you set their animation back to idle, and then stop any forces that are applied to it. Because during the collision event, we applied a permanent force to the object, so we need to use an action to stop it. And with this setup, they don't go back to idle until they land back on the ground, so you can knock them up or down, and they won't go back to moving around until these conditions are met. And then we want to set it up so the player can be hurt as well. And for this we're using a bite animation object, which is basically the same as the collision object, but this one you'll be able to see on screen. It's set up so that if the enemy's animation is idle, and they're flipped or not, cast a ray from the center of the enemy, either at 0 degrees or 180 degrees, for 40 pixels, to check to see if the player is there. And if they are, set the animation to attack. And then when the animation is set to attack, and again we're beyond the right frame of the animation, create the enemy attack object at the point that we've put on the enemy. And then check to see if the enemy is flipped, and if they are, flip the attack too so it makes sense. And then, when that attack animation finishes, change the enemy back to idle. And then when the enemy attack object's animation finishes, delete that object. And because of the way the earlier events were set up, Getting hit means you won't have control of your character anymore until the animation finishes playing and the animation gets set back to idle. Now, if you would like to learn more about enemies and how to give them different behaviors and movements, be sure to check out this video.